Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas Trimble. I'm Associate Professor of Teaching in the Department of English. And this presentation is oriented around FERPA, or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and what we can do as instructors and employees at the university. I will turn it over to my colleague.
Hi, I'm Liza Lagman-Spurl. I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager from the Office of the Registrar, and I'll be presenting on FERPA today. My time at the university, though, includes being an academic advisor for many years, both for the University Advising Center and the Honors College, before coming to the Office of the Registrar. So I've had plenty of time to answer many of these questions and look forward to any questions that you might have in the future. So let's begin. Let me go to the next. What is FERPA? So FERPA is an acronym for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It's a federal law that protects the privacy of student education records, and it applies to all schools that receive funds under an applicable program of the U.S. Department of Education. So in learning more about FERPA, we tend to think of it as a higher education thing and in terms of who owns the information, but it really does apply for all schools, K through and beyond. So who is protected under FERPA? FERPA rights begin for students when they turn 18 in terms of higher education, or they enroll and attend classes at a post-secondary institution. You may find that you have some classes that have dual enrolled students who are both in high school and taking college classes. If they're over 18, they are automatically the owner of their educational record. Otherwise, the rights go to their parents until they graduate and start college or turn 18. And then rights expire upon death. There are 4 main FERPA rights. The first one is to inspect and review an education record. So an educational record is anything that contains personally identifiable information. These would include obvious things like your name, address, your Wayne State ID, or other such common identifiers. But they also include things like enrollment records, including a class schedule, your rosters that you would use for your course, grades, the grade point average. If you have a class that you're grading using narrative evaluations, like in the law school, that would be considered an educational record. And any notes advising or as you held office hours, anything that's stored electronically is also considered part of the educational record. The second FERPA right is to request that an institution correct any records that the student believes are inaccurate or misleading. Now, if a student disagrees with their grade, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's inaccurate. They certainly have submitted work that you evaluate according to your syllabus. And after they've reviewed that with you, if they still disagree, there's a whole entire grade appeal process. Each college has their own steps listed on their websites. But just because the student doesn't like their grade doesn't mean that it's inaccurate. You are not required to correct something just because they disagree with it. Excuse me. But any other concerns above and beyond the grade appeal process where a student feels like something is inappropriate, inaccurate, or misleading can be referred to the Office of the Registrar. The next FERPA right we want to discuss is to control disclosure of an educational record. Students have the ability to identify persons that they would like to have access to their education record, whether to discuss their grades or financial aid or anything in regards to their education record. So there's a form on our website that allows them to identify who that person is, what their relationship is to the student, and it's pretty straightforward. It gets submitted, uploaded to our website, and then is processed a couple times a day. If a student decides that they want to revoke that right, they do need to email us directly. There's also something called directory information, and we'll discuss in a little bit more detail what that means. But a student can decide to mark their account as confidential, and at that point, when you see their emails, it'll show up as unavailable, because they're not revealing their access ID or any personally identifiable information. The confidential status remains until it's removed, and a lot of times students will submit the form, realize that it obscures information that they didn't want to have hidden, and so, excuse me, they submit the form to revoke it and allow their name and access ID to be displayed. The exception to the directory information and marking a form as confidential or an account as confidential is if a student is also a Wayne State employee. So if you have a student who's in the graduate school, or if you yourself decide to mark your account as confidential, in the Wayne State directory, your name and your department and your Wayne State email will still appear because we're a public institution. Excuse me. The next FERPA right is that a student can file a complaint if the university does not properly address their student concerns. So on your screen, you'll see the information for the Student Privacy Policy Office. This rarely happens, thankfully. We do everything we can to make sure that we're protecting students' information and that we're addressing their concerns as quickly as possible. So there are exceptions to FERPA. The first one is directory information, which we'll go into more detail in just a moment. In the case of a health or safety emergency, so if the student is under 21 and there's information regarding illegal drug use or possession of alcohol, public safety or some other entity might need to disregard FERPA and respond to the safety concerns for the student. You have a school official with a legitimate educational interest, such as discussing financial aid, or if you have one advisor who needs to ask a question about a student's record with another advisor, or if you yourself have a concern about a student's progress in your course and you want to talk to the department advisor. These are legitimate educational interests that don't require constant approval or permission from the student. There's also a situation where the military may ask the university for contact information for students under what's referred to as the Solomon Act. Wayne State directory information is available whenever you search for a student or an employee. At wayne.edu, you'll find that there's a search bar where you can find student info or your colleagues' info for that matter, and it includes the items listed here. The list gets updated periodically, but they're primarily information about the student being enrolled at the university. For athletics, there are more details such as height and weight and classification. This also includes any degrees that a student may have received from Wayne State and any honors or academic awards.
So we have a couple of slides here that discuss more specifically instructor responsibilities, and these are for graduate assistants and graduate teaching assistants who interact with students on a daily basis in the classroom. And so we've got one slide for do's and then another slide for don'ts, so we'll get to those. So think about the classroom. First of all, we want to make sure that we lock the computer, or at least turn off the screen or monitor when we are away from our desk. So this involves everything when you have to leave the classroom, during class, or at the end of a session. We want to encourage everyone to use their Wayne State email. Instructors should be communicating with students via their Wayne State email accounts. We want to hide student grades and our grade books, our Canvas grade books, when working with other students. So this might be a situation where a student comes up to the podium in a classroom, but that you've got either the course grade on a monitor that you can view. You want to hide that or mute the monitor. This could also be when a student comes to visit an instructor in the instructor's office for a conference. You want to make sure that if you've got student grades either out on pieces of paper, maybe you're grading quizzes or exams, or even if you've got your course grade book on Canvas on your computer monitor, again, that it's hidden from students. Make sure to log out of Canvas when you're leaving the classroom. This is something that we've all done, have forgotten that before, but try to make a point and a habit of logging out of Canvas and all other applications that require credentials when leaving the classroom. Make sure to obtain written consent from students when asked to share info with their parents or other persons. Sometimes students will say that, they're basically giving you their spoken or oral consent. That's really not enough when we want to make sure that we're protecting students' FERPA rights. We want to obtain written consent from them in the form of an email that we can document for them to give us that consent. And then we also want to sort of make sure that we're keeping record of those share requests and their outcome, that we're documenting that, so that if we're asked about it, we can document that. So now let's talk about a little bit about what we want to avoid as an instructor. We want to avoid discussing students' grade with other students, and this is a big one. So even when you're discussing, it's fine if you want to talk about, like, here is the average on an exam, or here is the average on assignment, but we don't want to discuss students' grades. And that involves things like calling out students who have done well. So let's say that a student did really well on an exam, or they got 100% of exam. We don't want to call that out. That the student has the right to be the privacy with regards to that grade. So we don't want to share that with other students. We don't want to share that with the entire class. We want to avoid sending group emails that discuss students' grades or academic status. So just as one example, you would not want to send an email that said, all 4 of you failed this week's quiz, so please make an appointment to meet with me. Or you would not say, all 4 of you got 100 on this week's quiz. Great job. Again, that students have a right to privacy regarding their grades and their marks on assignments. So that's something that we would not want to do. In general, we want to avoid sharing students' grades or personal information with third parties. Again, that's unless we're given explicit written permission from the student. Now, when, and Liza, you can help me with this, but when a student requests like a letter of recommendation or something like that, even if it's just an email from the student saying, well, will you please submit a letter of recommendation for me? And then in our letters of recommendation, it's very common to say, the student got this grade in the course and their final project was on this topic and they got a grade. That's okay. The student is giving us permission to do that. But in general, we would not share information with third parties when requested by those parties. Does that make, Liza, does that make sense before I get to that last one?
Yep, absolutely. Because the student in their email to you asking for that letter of recommendation and for you to speak to their performance is essentially giving you that written permission. There's an understanding. And usually with letters of recommendation, the student has waived their right to see what you've written about them so that you're being as candid as possible. But that is correct. Otherwise, you really wouldn't. You'd want to exercise caution and really think about the context of why this request is being made. In the context of a letter of recommendation, it's very appropriate, but less so for other scenarios.
And then instructors should not feel obligated to share information, even directory information, when requested by an external party or another person. As Liza said, there are exceptions to that, but they're fairly narrow. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. You should never, as an instructor, feel under pressure to share information. If you're ever not sure, it's absolutely appropriate to take a minute to review the rules and the guidelines, and whenever in doubt, to consult with the registrar's office or to refer to the student to the registrar's office, who can sort of either provide guidance or actually deal with those requests directly. So an instructor should never feel and should avoid feeling pressure to respond, particularly in a sort of, a situational kind of thing outside of those fairly narrow exceptions that Liza talked about just a minute ago. So now we've got a couple scenarios. These are things that instructors might actually encounter in the classroom where the FERPA guidelines kind of get put to the test. And so what we'll do here is I'll just kind of go over or preview the scenario, and then we'll give Liza a chance to kind of go, what would be our recommendation for how to respond. So scenario number 1, imagine that an angry or upset parent calls or sends an email and wants to know how their son's grades are for the semester. We could also talk about the situation where a parent is unhappy with a student's grade. So as an instructor, with FERPA in mind, Liza, how should instructors respond to this scenario?
So, in terms of how an instructor might respond, if you're unable to verify that a student has permitted the parent to discuss their educational record, as I mentioned earlier, there is a form that gets filed centrally, and there are different places that you can look at or that you can ask your department advisor for assistance in checking to see if a student has waived or given someone permission to discuss their record. You can basically just state federal guidelines prevent your discussing a specific student's performance or grades with them at this time. I would encourage them, the parent, to talk with their student. The idea here is that this is an opportunity for the student to take ownership and to be held accountable for their grades and how they're doing in the class. And so there are ways to redirect that conversation so that you're not the one who's disclosing the student's grade or discussing ways to change their grade. As Thomas mentioned, there's definitely, you can imagine scenarios where you have parents who might demand, I'm the one paying for the tuition. I'm the one who's sending the student to school. You must tell me these things. It's a paradigm shift for sure for many parents or guardians coming from high school into college. And so it is entirely appropriate at that moment to say, federal guidelines prohibit me from discussing this with you directly. We need to bring the student in, or please discuss this with your student, or have your student talk with me about being able to talk with you. There are certainly many polite ways, diplomatic ways to answer that, but you are certainly not required, unless you know for sure that that student has provided written permission to discuss their educational record with another individual. You are not required to answer directly.
Sounds good. All right, let's take a look at another scenario. Instructor wants to send an email to a small group of students, a subset of students, about an upcoming tutoring workshop. The text that the instructor wants to send to each student is identical and doesn't contain any specific information about students' grade in the course. What are some ways that an instructor could send a message like this safely? And by safely, we mean by adhering to the guidelines of FERPA and respecting students' privacy.
Mm-hmm.
How about this one?
So, using your Wayne State email account, you can use a mail merge program. Microsoft Word certainly has a way for you to identify recipients using an Excel spreadsheet to send out individual messages. Or you can include all of the students' email addresses in the blind carbon copy field. In any email program, there's a way to include addresses so that way the individual recipients only see the email address to them and they can't see who else has been notified.
Sounds good. All right, how about one more? Let's see how this goes.
All right.
All right. A student complains that a class assignment that requires students to make a video of themselves and upload the video to social media is an invasion of their privacy. Instructors, what should we do?
This is actually a true scenario that came up to my attention, I think, last year or so. And it was a really interesting discussion in terms of, one, what can actually be required within a class, and what a student could do in terms of responding to the instructor. So in this case, and in all cases, whenever a student has a concern or a complaint about something on their syllabus or an upcoming assignment, we encourage the student to speak to you as the instructors to see, well, what are the options? Let's not assume that there's just nothing and that they're going to fail it or that they should just drop the class or even withdraw. But as an instructor, you could consider making that social media aspect perhaps optional, and find other ways for students to interact with each other and share that information, such as posting to Canvas, or sharing, because within Canvas you can upload video, you can share presentations, you can have them do discussion boards. So that way it's an insular login secure environment for students to share those projects with each other.
So Liza, just to be clear on that one though, let's say an
Mm,
instructor, part of the learning outcome for an assignment was having the student post something to social media, a blog or something like that. Um, it doesn't sound like there's anything about that that would necessarily violate FERPA. We might say that's really not the best course of action. Let's look for an alternative there. But it's not like the instructor is disclosing private information. So we're recommending a particular course of action that's a bit more flexible, but even this scenario doesn't directly violate FERPA as we've written it. Would you agree with that?
yeah, I think so. I think my guess is that when we talked about when I thought about that question, um, I think we're assuming that students wouldn't be necessarily savvy enough to create their own standalone social media account. And so if they posted it from their already existing content, which might then expose an audience to them that they wouldn't normally reach out to, perhaps, that might make more sense. So it's about being mindful about what we assume students know about social media, and what sort of a situation that might put them in. If we ask them to upload something to their own personal account, perhaps the assignment might include go to any pick any account, right? Pick any platform,
Yeah.
go to Instagram and create a student account just for this one use and then upload something. The other thing is really thinking about being mindful that there are some people who will not want to show their face in a video. So perhaps that becomes an optional item, as opposed to saying, well, you must show yourself. And um, it's just part of this ongoing conversation of, well, what's the spirit of the assignment, and how can we meet it in a way that is both engaging and yet respectful of different levels of comfort in terms of exposing them. I'm sure it's similar to the ongoing conversation of, do you require a camera to be on in an online class or not? That can be tricky for some people depending on what their comfort levels are, there's so many different things that people bring to the table. So it's about being aware of the fact that what might seem like a very straightforward assignment that you might assume your students would totally be on board with, and then suddenly finding that, hey, maybe there's some things that are open to interpretation that might be viewed as an invasion of privacy when you certainly never meant it that way to begin with. So,
Great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
mhm. So, in terms of just summarizing what we've talked about here and how FERPA can help um, both protect student privacy and provide some guidelines and parameters, just so that we're all on the same page in terms of student security, student information. Whenever there's at all a scenario, when in doubt, don't give it out. Pause if you have a request that you're not sure if it qualifies as an appropriate situation to provide information. Again, remember that an immediate answer is not required. In many cases, a response is due in, like, I think it's 45 days is what's actually listed in the FERPA guidelines themselves. But the idea is that there is enough time to make sure that the person that you're discussing a student's educational record with, who is not the student themselves, has been cleared and is approved by the student, or that it's an appropriate request to begin with. You can also find more general or even secure ways to provide information. So, going back to that parent scenario, let's say the parent was like, well, what if my student gets an F in this, and will they then fail the course and their lives will be ruined forever? Of course not. And that's a question that you can answer appropriately to say, well, generally speaking, if a student were to fail a quiz, it's fine. There are definitely other ways that they can make up that work, or they can work really hard and get tutoring and eventually receive a better grade. There are ways to be more generic in your responses. You can also ask for clarification from your fellow instructors, from your department chair, from the dean's office, and obviously from the office of the registrar. You are not required to just sort of bumble in the dark and hope to find the right answer. This is exactly what we're here for. So, Wayne State has provided online resources to assist you with understanding FERPA better and helping you apply it to your everyday work. So on our webpage, we have several different links and guidelines, as well as repeating this information about the 4 student rights. There are forms, as I mentioned earlier, and you might want to take a look at them yourselves just so that you have a better sense of what's available to students and how they might identify someone with whom you can discuss their record, or if they want to restrict or release their directory information. And then Wayne State General Counsel also has information about FERPA. Additionally, the U.S. Department of Education provides resources and training, including a module specific to colleges and universities. Having completed it myself, I can tell you that it doesn't take very long. 45 minutes is the outside amount of time that they expect this sort of thing to take. And you get a certificate of completion at the end, which is always a good thing. And it's very informative in very straightforward language. So if you want additional training or have further questions, these would be some additional resources for you.
Excellent. So everyone, thanks so much on behalf of the Graduate School and the Registrar's Office. We hope you found this information helpful. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to use the links in the presentation. We're always interested in helping to try and answer those questions. But thanks again.
Thank you very much.